This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's the place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Well, welcome, folks. Here we are one more time at Core Brain Journal, and we have a very, very interesting gentleman today, Chip Fischer with Fisher Wallace Laboratories. He is the inventor of, the person who put together the Fisher Wallace Stimulator, which right off the bat is going to say, oh my gosh, what is this? And so welcome, Chip. We're going to talk more about it in just a moment.
Thank you.
So Chip, listen, let's talk about, I'm going to do an intro real quickly, and then we'll talk about who you are as a person. Then the audience can get an idea of what we're doing here. Chip Fischer is in New York. He is the president and CEO of Fisher Wallace Laboratories, the manufacturers of the Fisher Wallace Stimulator. It's a non-invasive home use medical device which treats depression, anxiety and insomnia, as well as different forms of chronic pain, including fibromyalgia. And we'll be talking a little bit about some other studies they're doing regarding bipolar depression. And it's using a mild form of electrotherapy. Now, right off the bat, Chip, there are many people saying, oh my gosh, what in the heck is he talking about? So before we get into the details and the technology, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into this in the first place?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. This is really very exciting, and it's nice to be able to speak to your audience. I grew up in a family where my father was an entrepreneur, and he founded Fischer Radio Corporation, which was a very well-known brand of high-fidelity equipment until the late 60s, early 70s. He founded it in 1937. So I sort of grew up in the electronics world. I was always fascinated with electronics and also patented technologies. His company invented and perfected the stereo phonograph, which is really what put him on the map in the late 50s. So that's kind of a little bit of my family background. And I was always interested. I'm not an MD. I'm a businessman, but I'm very close to a lot of scientists, and I was always fascinated with things electronic. I actually, although thank you for the credit, I didn't actually invent the device, but I bought the patents to the device from the inventors, Saul and Bernard List, who were two MIT electrical engineers who worked originally on the device that we're going to talk about today for treating chronic pain. It works in a similar way to, it actually is, what's called a TENS unit, which is transcranial electronic nerve stimulation. Many people buy them after they have surgery, or if they have a problem with an arm or a leg. For mild electrotherapy, use it after physical therapy. There are hundreds of them on the market, but what they wanted to do was to invent one that could be used for largely for geriatric patients. Many geriatric patients, because TENS devices start at 50 to 150 milliamps. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it can be uncomfortable for some patients. And so what they wanted to do was invent something that would be comfortable for everyone. They were very successful in the 1980s in inventing the device that we're going to talk about today. It's the same device, but just slightly altered for transcranial use. It was very successful as a body stimulator, and it still is, though that's not what we primarily market it for. Our device works on 1 to 4 milliamps of electricity rather than 50 to 100, which is a microcurrent. And the reason we're able to have this work so effectively, just to be brief, is that on 1 to 4 milliamps is that we use a very high carrier frequency of about 15,000 hertz, which allows us to penetrate both the brain and the body without a lot of amplitude. So it can work on batteries. It doesn't require a lot of electricity. Now, just moving forward a little bit, having succeeded using it on the body, they realized that this was such a low amount of electricity that they then began to experiment with the frequencies that would allow this to stimulate key neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and beta endorphin, which are primarily stimulated these days by drugs. And it took them another 10 years to derive those frequencies, which were a bit lower than the one that I mentioned. And so you can use it transcranially now to stimulate, and very safely, I might add, to stimulate key neurotransmitters that are usually only stimulated by drugs. It stimulates serotonin, beta-endorphin, and dopamine primarily, and we've found that through plasma and saliva studies, and also other peer studies that we'll talk about later. And it also lowers cortisol, which is the stress hormone.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, when you really think about it, what's going on with the technology and neuroscience, it just offers so many additional opportunities for considering where we are when we're stuck with medications and treatment failure. Treatment failure is far too pervasive, and this sounds like it's an answer. We're moving down the pike with, as I said a moment ago, additional opportunities.
Very much so. Now, these are, electrotherapy is based on age-old principles. Most people don't know that. The first use of electrotherapy, everyone will be interested to know, was by the physician of a Roman senator, Scribonius Largus, in 46 AD. This senator, who was vacationing in Capri or somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, suffered terribly from gout and migraines. And the physician knew that the torpedo fish, which is found in the Mediterranean, has an electrical charge, which is used to kill its prey. But of course, it's very small. And so what he did was he put a fish on top of the senator's head, and it suppressed his migraines. And it also, on his foot, treated his gout. So that's the first known use of electrotherapy.
That is so interesting.
So this is not a new concept. And then you page forward to the era of batteries and understanding, and Volta and the understanding of voltage and electricity and how to harness it. And there were inventions that came about in the 17 and 1800s, but unfortunately they couldn't harness the correct amount of electricity, and they didn't really know anything about frequencies and frequency management and how those different frequencies influence the body. The body is influenced primarily by frequencies in the 0 to 100 hertz range, which is where our device operates. And there are other devices in the market, but they're not quite as effective as ours. Ours is the only one that actually works transcranially. And so just a very brief, because I know this is everybody's next question, as you hinted at, is how is this different from ECT or electroconvulsive therapy? Electroconvulsive therapy and CES, this is called CES, or cranial electrotherapy stimulation, that's what the FDA calls it, works on the same principles. It uses alternating current. The big difference is that with electroconvulsive therapy, it works on 800 to 1,000 milliamps, so you have to induce a seizure, essentially. There's a risk of memory loss, and there are a lot of other side effects that come along with it. The inventors of ECT never really experimented with anything milder, and of course this took a long time to develop, and these frequencies are patented and known to a very few, and so we were able to harness a much smaller and safer level of electrotherapy so that this could be used as a home device, and that's really where the comparison ends. It's that we have harnessed something that is safe and easy to use that works on very successful principles in a much more invasive technology.
Chip, that is so interesting. Now, tell us what the differentiation is. We had a researcher on at Core Brain Journal early on. I think his episode was 005. I can't remember it right off, but he was talking about deep transcranial magnetic stimulation. Now, what's the difference between the Fisher Wallace Stimulator and transcranial magnetic stimulation?
Sure. Well, TMS actually uses magnets, and it's used externally, although there is some contact with the skull. And the frequencies there are a little bit different from ours. They're a little bit higher, and the device does work, but their success rate just isn't as high as ours. The principles are not as sound in terms of actually harnessing electrotherapy and using it effectively. It's done partly with electrotherapy and partly with magnets. And so it's a different philosophy. And the main problem is that it's very cumbersome. It requires a physician or a practitioner who understands how to place the magnets on a TMS machine. You sit in a large chair, and you have to go in for sessions. So it's not a home use device. So the gap there is really the time commitment that has to happen, and it's also the expense. The TMS requires anywhere initially of about 8 to 12 treatments in a physician's office. And then you have a problem with maintenance. A lot of people, even though TMS can be effective, a lot of people will relapse, and they will not be able to have the kind of sessions, maintenance sessions that they need to, A, because of time, and B, because of expense. So that's really where it ends. And also physicians have found that we have a much higher effectiveness rate with this. It's approximately 75 to 80% of patients will respond positively to what we do. And in TMS, the response rate is somewhere in the 35 to 40% range, which is not bad, but it's not in the same range as what we have in terms of success.
Thank you. That's a very interesting summary. And the good news is this is on audio, so people can replay it. You really hit a number of very interesting points in a short period of time there. So how did you then become so involved on a personal level with the Fisher Wallace Stimulator? How did all that take place?
Sure. Well, I really met someone by accident. My first partner, Martin Wallace, who was a cell biologist and also an addictionologist who knew the inventors, Saul and Bernard List, when they were alive. I came along with them. Our company now, in its current form, is about 10 years old. The technology dates back to about 1991. And my first partner was stuck in a building in 9/11. He had post-traumatic stress disorder. He was self-medicating and drinking and trying different therapies, and nothing really worked. And he found this device through a homeopathic practitioner that he knew, who knew the inventors, who were both at that time elderly. They'd gotten the company off the ground and been successful in the 80s with a pain device, but they hadn't really succeeded in marketing the product to consumers in the internet age. And so it was really more of a marketing challenge than anything else. We knew the device worked, and there was enough research.
We lost you right there. Could you? Yeah, something just happened. Just please repeat that last piece.
Sure. Start with where. Okay, you mean how I came to this?
Yeah, you just cut out there for just a second.
No worries. So I met my partner, Martin Wallace, who is a cell biologist and addictionologist at Columbia, in 2006. He had actually been stuck in a building in 9/11 and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Got that, yeah.
He met Saul and Bernard List through a homeopath that they both knew, was introduced to the device, and it was able to suppress his symptoms, as we have done, of course, with other PTSD patients, including veterans, very successfully. The device has an effect on the parasympathetic nervous system, which has to do with anxiety and hypervigilance and a whole bunch of other things. So he was able to treat that, and then he started using it in his practice as an addictionologist to treat both cocaine and heroin addiction, and which is something that we're deeply involved with now tangentially. And he was very enamored with this. Saul List actually passed away. He was a major shareholder in the spring of 2006. That's just around the time that we met. There was no one to take over the company, and so we bought the patents from his estate and then started to market the device successfully starting in the beginning of 2007. So it was really sort of an accidental meeting of minds. I was interested in this very specifically for myself because unfortunately I have a bit of heredity of all of these symptoms of depression, anxiety, and insomnia. It just sort of runs in my family, and I'm very open about talking about it these days, and I always was. And I was seeking a solution. I had actually used a number of pharmacological drugs in the 1990s when they came out, Prozac, Wellbutrin, and a number, Paxil. There's a whole list. I didn't find that any of them were very effective for long periods of time, and they had enormous side effects for me. So I stopped using them. So I essentially tried to solve the problem but I found that the solutions were not effective for me. We're not anti-pharma. We're just, here with a different type of solution that works very well. So I had a little bit of personal history in terms of trying to treat my own symptoms. I came across this, found it was fantastic, and interviewed a lot of people who had used it. There were quite a few at the time, even then, who had used the device, and we did our homework on the research and the background of how the device was developed and designed, and it's really actually very complicated, but works very well. And I can explain some of that in lay terms as we go along. But that was my period of discovery, and then we felt that this was something that should be an option. And so now, in an age when everyone is starting to understand and get used to wearables of all types and all of these applications that measure sleep and mood and all sorts of teletherapy and many new developments that we've come into our own in terms of an acceptance level of a home use device that it can actually treat these symptoms non-invasively.
Well, you said so many things that are interesting to our audience, because we have a number of people who, in fact, we have a whole page that's just for veterans alone, dealing with traumatic brain injury and PTSD. And we're going to certainly add this episode to that page, because we see it. I'm down in the military town down here in Virginia Beach, and we see people in our offices on a regular basis who are dealing. We deal with SEALs. They don't tell us who they are or what they're doing. I mean, it's a very mysterious outfit, but they let us know and they go out the back door. And because it's not something that group of people really wants to announce, but they have many tours, and many of them are walking wounded from multiple tours in the Middle East. And but anyway, so PTSD is a big one. It was a really interesting tease, because we're very interested, and I have been personally interested in for years in addiction medicine and the implications, the really wide implications for how do we deal with refractory individuals who've had their 30-day program. Nobody gets 30-day program anymore unless they're out in California. And they just still don't have the coping skills and are refractory to antidepressant medications, any medications. And so this is very interesting. I know we'll be interested to hear a little bit about cocaine and heroin. What's actually, can you tell us a little bit about that,
Sure.
please?
Sure, I will. Let me, if I may, just step back 1 second to PTSD and TBI, where we've had enormous success. We have a retired Brigadier General, Stephen Znakis, who's a widely quoted expert on PTSD, as well as Frank Ochberg, who's also a PTSD expert, and they've used it very successfully in their practices. One of the issues, and this is sort of a piece of information I think your listeners will find very interesting, is that what a lot of people don't understand is how much more exposure veterans in this war or wars over the past 13 years have had to trauma and traumatic environments as compared to other wars. In World War II, the average veteran had about 70 days of combat, broken up by periods of rest, sometimes long periods of rest, which was restorative of a certain nature. In Vietnam, a volunteer army, there were approximately 200 days of combat. In this war, the average person who started in, say, 2003 to 2005 and has re-upped numerous times has had anywhere between 500 and 1,000 days of combat exposure, which is greater than any war in history. And man is really not meant to have that level of exposure. It's really just too much. Now, that can be either in country, under fire, or it can be the stress of being exposed to improvised explosive devices, IED. You've heard a lot about that, and that's cause of a lot of the TBI that's happened. And a lot of exposure there, and also there really wasn't any safe zone when you were over in the Middle East. You could have something happen to you when you were waiting in line at PX to buy a tube of toothpaste. So that sense of hypervigilance and not being in a safe space and not having a front line is unique to this last series of wars and unique to these veterans. And therefore, their level of exposure is much higher. It's been constant. It's been unrelenting. And so the actual impact of that has been enormous. And one of the things that happens when you have excessive exposure as a veteran to combat situations or a combat environment or a pseudo-combat environment is that you end up having more and more stress, which eventually shrinks the amygdala, which is in the center of the brain, and the communication between the amygdala and the cerebral cortex, where you have your judgment, which would lead you to away, if you have, with good judgment, away from excessive behavior or harmful behavior like alcohol and drugs, is reduced. And so your brain chemistry is really literally changed. Now, many of the pharmaceutical drugs that have been used have been found actually to have only exacerbated those problems, unfortunately, but they continue to be used in practice, in many therapeutic practices, unfortunately. This is very different. So that's one thing. And then dovetailing into the addiction arena, we have found that, and we continue to try to prove this scientifically, that we feel, and there has been research that has backed this up, mostly in animal studies, that a small form of cortical stimulation, as we do, a very minor amount of alternating current, which is what we use, in the same area of the brain as they used in these studies, could actually have an effect on reversing dopaminergic urges, especially in cocaine-addicted rats. And they have shown that it would actually change the dopamine pathways in a way that one would no longer have addiction tendencies. And so that's really sort of the holy grail, proving that on a scientific basis with much larger studies. But we understand that this device has that potential. Because we've used it in many therapeutic environments. And we're about to do actually a very large study with one of the largest treatment centers in the country, to show two things. A, if this will improve or lower addiction rates, and B, whether during detoxification with standard medication, which is used now, like buprenorphine and methadone, that this will reduce the side effects of detoxification, which are the two greatest things that send people out of addiction treatment. That people just cannot stand the physiological change that occurs, painful as it is, and as much as they want to get better, when they are detoxed from heroin and cocaine particularly. So that will ameliorate, that will help with that passage, and we do have research that shows that actually has a strong effect and is helpful as an adjunct therapy, in addition to its potentials to treat addiction.
See, that's so interesting. I mean, and then the other one that you didn't quite mention, but I think deserves our attention, is the long-term withdrawal from benzodiazepines, which can be months and complicated and very frequently troubled by relapses, just because the detox is so challenging.
Indeed, that's very much the case, and so that's an area that we continue to work on.
And so let's go ahead and take that segue into traumatic brain injury as well. You were talking something about that. Could you elaborate a little more on traumatic brain injury, if you don't mind?
Yes, absolutely. We actually, rather refreshingly, in the last couple of days since we last spoke, just had a report from a physician who's been working with several NCAA basketball players who have suffered from, actually as a sidebar, to CTE, which is the cumulative aspects of concussions that occur both in basketball, because it's a very physical sport, and football, and we were able to suppress both rage and anger in those patients, and so we're hoping to do a larger study on that. But with traumatic brain injury, specifically with vets who've been exposed to IED blasts, the brain is altered somehow by the violence of a blast. It doesn't necessarily have to affect them physically on the exterior, but the brain is very malleable and can move around, and therefore the changes that occur have largely to do with production of key neurotransmitters, and it can also cause insomnia problems and the onset of migraine headaches. And so what this device does is it increases blood flow, it improves cognitive aspects, and it releases different parts of the brain in TBI that may have been shut down as a result of trauma. And it starts to encourage different parts of the brain to communicate with other parts of the brain. We don't quite know how, but on a generalized basis, we know that there is stimulation of different parts of the brain rather than very specific with certain drugs. And therefore, different parts of the brain can begin to communicate. We've also seen in PTSD patients that that level of hypervigilance and those excessive levels of cortisol that come along with hypervigilance when someone's been in country are reduced. It's sort of like a clock that has a second hand that's ticking, but it's standing in place. It can't release itself. And this releases itself. The device will trigger REM sleep in patients where their REM sleep has been suppressed. They only have nightmares, and they don't have dreams, which are very healing. So there's a cleansing process that goes on here that's very subtle, and it appears that this mild form of electrotherapy will stimulate REM sleep and also help with TBI by reducing insomnia and migraines.
Well, that brings us to this other point, which is sleep itself, because it's quite interesting, but one of the indications that you have in your literature is for sleep itself, whether they've had TBI or PTSD, that sleep itself could be helped by individuals we see so many individuals who are refractory to sleep medications. I mean, there are not a lot of medications that one can use, and then if you get into it, that whole thing you just said as a quick aside with the relationship of cortisol, all of it can confound attempts to sleep. So let's just talk about sleep in general for a moment, if you don't mind.
Yes, well, sleep and the major. Well, there are two things that are going on with sleep today. We are all very stimulated by our devices, and a lot of people use their devices before they go to bed. And they don't have them on the blue light setting, usually, which a lot of phones now have. So that does affect people's sleep. But largely, and we live in a stressful world, and people worry about their futures, and people don't understand how important sleep really is, and how much sleep one needs as an adult. Not 4 or 5 hours, really more like 6 or 7, and sometimes 8 or more. So, but in the medication sphere, a lot of the medications that are out on the market are very good at inducing deep sleep, stage 4 sleep. But what people don't realize is that a lot of these drugs also, in contrast, will suppress REM sleep. If you don't have a combination of deep sleep and REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, you're not going to dream, and you're not going to have restful sleep. You will, it will knock you out and put you to sleep, but it will not push you through all of the standard cycles that you would have if you had homeostasis and had a balanced system and were sleeping in a quiet environment.
So it's not restorative. So you have sleep, but it's not restorative. You really don't actually resynchronize the brain.
That's correct. That's correct. And that's what this device does. It does trigger REM sleep very quickly. And so even a lot of patients see an effect very, very quickly with this. I mean, some take a while as well. Some can take, 2 weeks to a month. But most patients will see a reversal of this trend. And a lot of people who've been addicted to sleeping medications have been using our device to titrate off of them and to have something that's therapeutic. It's very, very difficult to get off of benzodiazepines and any other form of sleep medication as well.
Well, Chip, in our list of refractory maladies, if you don't mind, the whole bipolar 2 issue came up with the research that you folks were involved with at Mount Sinai Beth Israel. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. This was a crossover study that was done with about 20 patients. It's actually the first time that anyone has successfully published a peer study showing a device to treat bipolar depression without triggering mania or any other side effects. To our knowledge, we have never seen a device that's been as effective as this. And the patients that used it had a very strong reaction and were able to use it. And then many of them stopped taking medication. We didn't have them do it right away, but in many cases, these patients now are only using cranial electrotherapy stimulation as opposed to a combination of this and pharmacology. So it was a very successful study and has been presented at a number of major conferences. And we hope to do a larger study on this. But what's exciting is that this is, aside from the depression market in which we're deeply involved, this is a very, very specific and very, very difficult to treat subset of the depression market. and which has only been addressed with very invasive drugs. Many of the drugs that are out there are toxic if taken over time, and but there have been no other solutions until now. So this is a very exciting scientific breakthrough for us.
It is. It's so encouraging because actually, as we're talking and as our listeners are traveling with us through these different maladies, I mean, what you folks are doing quite successfully and documenting well is interventions with the most refractory challenges, the ones that everybody's puzzled about. How do we go into that next one? For example, I mean, addiction and bipolar illness, PTSD, TBI. It's really very encouraging.
Thank you. And we hope to do more work as time goes on, especially with veterans and those who were very severely impacted by mental illness. It's the potential here is enormous and very exciting. And of course, in the opioid crisis that we face now, which is only getting worse and worse, the potential to treat hundreds of thousands of patients is there, and we believe that sadly crisis is the catalyst for change.
Yes.
And we are in an environment where therapies like ours are being taken much more seriously, and states can no longer afford to, for example, use substitute drugs. It is a environmentally poor decision. It's also an economically poor decision, and the Medicaid and Medicare budgets of all of these states are being taxed to their limits, and therefore something like this, which is not an expensive solution and doesn't require a lot of replacement parts. We're talking about the replacement of sponges and batteries over time. The device has a very long shelf life and can be used in the privacy of one's home, so you don't have all of the clinical aspects of having to monitor somebody so carefully with regard to the potential to abuse these substitute drugs. Now, many of these drugs, including methadone, have been combined by addicts with benzodiazepines to mimic a heroin high. So you have now an additional problem from when methadone was first invented, which was actually in the 1940s by the Germans, to help keep soldiers awake. Most people don't know about that. There's a brilliant documentary called Methadonia, which is on Netflix, which I would encourage people to watch to give a history of that. And these drugs are often combined with other drugs, benzodiazepines particularly, which knock someone's circadian rhythms out of whack, and it's very hard to recover from that. So we have a lot of experimental polypharmacy going on the part of people who've had addiction, and this is something that will relieve them of their symptoms.
Well, the addiction and the opiate, the serious problem of opiate addiction across the country is really an important topic, and it's a great segue to get over to the next part of one of the things we really do need to talk about, which takes us back to that early part in our interview, the 46 AD with the gout and the torpedo fish, and that is the somatic aspect of it. I mean, part of the reason that the epidemic is there with the opiates is pain is not adequately addressed pervasively with medications. Could you talk a little bit about how the stimulator could actually help with pain?
Sure. Well, we feel that there's and physicians have backed this up, that there is a connection with regard to pain to the brain itself. And it's not just topical. So topical pain can be caused by stress. It can be caused by diet and other imbalances. And basically, in the case of fibromyalgia, which actually has been treated somewhat effectively on occasion by antidepressants, is affected by something like this. Because we've shown in studies that we did at Harvard, actually, that this device is reaching as deep as the basal ganglia, which is quite deep into the brain. Right. And so, and again, without a lot of amplitude. So what you're doing is you're stimulating different parts of the brain, and you're also creating release mechanisms when someone has had excessive stress, which can cause shingles and fibromyalgia and a whole bunch of other things. And so, and a lot of which has to do with aging. So we have had great success in these areas. More studies need to be done, but as a side benefit to chronic pain, both fibromyalgia and migraines. Another area that we've had success in, and this is more of a suppression of symptoms than it is a cure, is in Lyme patients. Lyme is caused by the spirochete, and so it's resident in someone's body and it sort of pops up and does different things to your neurological system. And we haven't really figured out exactly what on a broad basis. But what this does is it appears to, especially by improving blood flow in the brain, and somehow suppressing the worst aspects of spirochete influence, that it will actually suppress symptoms. So there are a lot of subtleties that we have seen, and some quite by accident, in patients who have very severe symptoms.
Well, a whole nother thing comes up as we're talking about it, because you just, in passing, mentioned the basal ganglia, and it started me thinking about tic disorder. Have you done any work with tic disorder, which is another very refractory condition that so often comes up with individuals, even if you're trying to treat the ADHD with a stimulant medication, then the whole situation, the whole treatment enterprise can become completely confounded by regressions with tics. So have you had
with regard to, you mean with an insect or
no,
with,
tic disorder,
tics?
Tic disorder, I'm sorry.
So facial tics.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. We don't have any evidence on that, actually. It's always been an interest of ours, but we've not pursued anything there. But we have published studies on other neurological aspects that we just have not had time to pursue. One of them is we did a pediatric safety study with cerebral palsy patients, and we found that this actually suppressed spasticity, at least in the time that the patients were using it. So there are all sorts of things that remain unexplored or sort of moderately explored that we would like to do over time. But the greatest influence that we feel we can have is in psychiatric symptoms, because they're the hardest to treat, and they're the aspects that have been most affected by pharmacology with regard to modest success, and then in some cases not great success with regard to side effects. So we've focused our efforts largely there, with the hope that we will go farther into the chronic pain arena as time goes on.
Well, you've really said a mouthful. I'm sure that our listeners are there just as I am, trying to fasten the seatbelt and aware of being overwhelmed by the interesting information that you've shared with us today. We really appreciate it. It's on the side of amazing. I hate to sound too effusive, but hey, I like the fact that it's peer reviewed. I like the fact that you've done the research. I think it's absolutely important that we really respect individuals who are doing the research, and this isn't Possum Hollow University that you're talking about. These are people that have actually sat down and done the work with very, very refractory conditions and published it. So that's very hopeful and very encouraging.
Thank you, and we understand that we wish to pursue more research over time. It's expensive, it's cumbersome, and takes a long time, but we have an interest in doing it, and over time we will publish larger and even deeper studies. We're actually we just started a 100-patient study on insomnia at the University of Texas, and actually they chose us rather than the other way around, and it's being funded by the university, which is a great honor. So they've obviously looked at this very carefully, and they feel that this is something that could have an enormous effect, and that they wanted to get involved in. So they've taken the ball. We're also working with Walter Reed Hospital on a possible study, which is very close to getting approved, to treat PTSD and TBI symptoms, because this is such an arena that of importance. And as I said, when you've looked at every other solution and you realize most things don't work, you have to look at scalable solutions. We are not opposed, by the way, to, as I mentioned before, to the whole pharma world. That's not our goal. Our goal is to provide a different type of solution, and for patients to really compare the two and to see which works for them. Nothing works for everyone. We have a 75 to 80% success rate. There are people who have intractable problems and symptoms, and they're not going to be solved. But that's very rare in our case, and we hope to continue to do more research work. And as the science of the brain develops, and we know more and more about the brain, more money is being spent on the aspects of, how do we influence change? What is the brain really like? What do we know about it? What don't we know about it? How is it influenced? Then all of that research will help ours in the long run, and it will help us help people around the world, which is what we really want to do.
Well, Chip Fischer, thank you so much for coming on this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Could you give us the link? It's going to be in the show notes, but tell us where you'd like people to go to learn more about the Fisher Wallace Stimulator, if you will, please.
I'm delighted, and thank you for having me. Our website is fisherwallace.com, FisherWallace.com. And for those of you who may be listening in Canada, we have a Canadian website, which is fisherwallace.ca. The device, by the way, is approved in Canada, and it's FDA-cleared in this country, and we have just received clearances in both Mexico and Brazil, so we're going to be marketing it there, as well as in Europe, where we already have clearance. So that's the best place to go. There are many videos, there are many research articles, and if you want more research than that's on the site, we have people on the phone and in chat all day and all night until midnight. And so you can ask for larger amounts of research on very specific topics. We're happy to email it to you.
Thank you very much, Chip Fischer. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time, coming on board. And let's talk again. When you get your next level of research done, we'll talk again. This is absolutely imperative that we get this out for the public, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.